So Donald Trump and the Republicans have been pushing their big, beautiful bill. And what the heck is in this thing? Well, the Washington Post has a really great summary. I want to go over it with you. And if you're into the nitty gritty of policy, you've come to the right place. So let's just jump right in. And I want to hear your thoughts and I'll share mine. Headline: What's in Trump and Republicans' giant tax and immigration bill? And first, they actually have this really good overview, so you get a sense of an idea of like where the saving slash spending is. So $2.2 trillion it'll cost essentially to extend the 2017 Trump tax cut. So that's a big portion of this thing. They're also going to increase the standard deduction, increase child tax credit, right? You can see it right there. So those add up together to about 4 trillion. So that's the bulk of it. And it's important to, lay it out in a chart like this, because if you just hear, individual items, that kind of make it feel like it's all equal weight, but it's clearly not, as you can see. Other things you got on here is cuts to Medicaid. You also have getting rid of climate change money, right? Green energy kind of stuff. And then you have the raising the SALT cap to 30,000. If you're unfamiliar with that one, that's basically if you pay state tax, do you want to get double taxed on your federal, right? So they put a cap on that at 30. Well, that's the proposal. We'll go through this whole thing, and you're probably wondering, what my general opinion on this is. A lot of this stuff, when you're talking about tax cuts, it often favors your Elon Musk and your billionaire class, and it throws the whole system out of whack. And so that's why it's important to cover this one literally first. So we'll read it together. It says, extend the 2017 Trump tax cuts. Trump's 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act cut taxes for individuals of nearly all income levels, concentrating most of the benefits among the wealthiest earners and corporations. The business tax cuts are permanent, but the individual portions expire at the end of the year, meaning that if Congress doesn't act, tax rates will go up on most households. The Republican bill would extend the lower rates for individuals. So it's important to mention this one first, because when you talk about these kind of things, like 1 percentage point, for example, a difference in say taxes, for the wealthy compared to the lower income groups is significant, right? Depending on what your wealth and your income is, and also how do you define wealth and income, and what's taxable or not taxable, right? So there's a whole slew of stuff. You can go over that, but basically just of it, that is a bulk of what Trump wants to do, right? Extend the tax cuts, and it benefits the wealthy. Increase the standard deduction. So this one actually, and I just want to go through it in an honest way. I'm actually not against increasing the standard deduction. So tax cuts for the wealthy, I'm not really for that one. Tax, decreases, right? Tax cuts for, regular, everyday, middle class and working Americans. I'm okay with that one. So standard deduction, I have no problem with that. Cuts to Medicaid, I'm not a fan of. I'll be honest with you, I'm not a fan of cutting Medicaid. I think this will be grossly unpopular. And what they're going to try to do is they'll try to put it through the cuts of Medicaid in kind of sneaky ways. How would you do it sneaky ways? So basically, you can pile on a bunch of paperwork onto people. Okay, so for example, I'll just read a little bit so you guys can understand this stuff, and you'll know this stuff's important to talk about. To meet budget goals, Republicans' plans to cut Medicaid spending could strip coverage from 8.7 million people and lead to 7.6 million more uninsured people over 10 years. The legislation calls for new requirements for beneficiaries, including copays for those above 100% the federal poverty level, and work requirements for many able-bodied childless adults. It would also tighten eligibility verification rules and limit taxes state charge Medicare medical providers as a roundabout way of collecting more federal Medicaid dollars. Here, the tightened eligibility and verification rules. Basically, when you put on work requirements, you can also add a level of bureaucracy and paperwork that might confuse people or be difficult to do. Or if you don't invest in the system itself, it'll be difficult to file. So basically, you have to prove that you're working. And I think it's like 80 hours a month or something like that. And these things are subject to change. But basically, you can cut Medicaid by depending on how you have people file the paperwork, or whatever with their work requirements. So there's that. This is an interesting one, the SALT tax. So again, it has to do with like your state tax and your federal tax. I'll read this. It says a group of blue state Republicans are at loggerheads with House GOP leadership over the state and local tax deduction, which lets filers write off the amount they paid in local tax from their federal tax bill, right? So you're trying to avoid a double taxation here. The 2017 tax law capped the SALT deduction at $10,000, but that limit expires at the end of the year. The Republicans' proposal raised that cap to $30,000, far below what the blue state GOP lawmakers had demanded. The impasse could imperil the fate of the entire package because of House Republicans' slim majority. So that's kind of an interesting one that they'll fight over. And, this one is an interesting one because I think it will benefit people who essentially make enough in order to claim this. So, for some people, it won't affect you at all. But if you're in a higher income brackets, this is, of course, very, very important to you. The issue would be is if you don't put a cap on it, right, you could just theoretically claim all of your state income tax as a deduction on your federal tax. So I don't know how they handle this kind of thing in other countries. I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on this because I can certainly see in the American system, right, where you have state and federal taxes being separate, it creates all sorts of, how can I say, major differences between states. And one of the big things that I noticed kind of reading through this stuff, and this is an example of it, says making states pay for SNAP, is oftentimes Republicans are like, well, we're not against certain things. We'll just make it the responsibility of the state. So like Republicans would make the case, well, we're cutting federal education programs, stuff like that. We're not really against education. We just want the states to handle it. But if the states can't fund things, and oftentimes the red states, which is the Republican states, they're just not as wealthy as some of the blue states. And so it's kind of crazy that the Republicans are actually hurting their own constituents, but also, to be fair, they're hurting all constituents. So, but in particular, yes, Republicans in the red states who are in the poorer states are going to get hurt a lot by a lot of the Republican things. And so oftentimes the Republicans and Trump, this kind of stuff, they try to get you distracted. They just want you to think about, trans this and trans that, and make it seem like that's the most important issue. But reality, this kind of stuff actually is quite important. That's why I'm going through the nitty gritty of it, just so you guys can see what's in the bill. Increase the child tax credit for some. I'm actually not against this. I'm fine with that. The child tax credit is a tax break for filers with children. The Republican measure would increase the tax credit to $2,500 per child from $2,000, but not every family can qualify. The legislation limits eligibility to parents or guardians with Social Security numbers, essentially requiring those people to be citizens. That would mostly exclude non-citizen parents from claiming the credit on behalf of a child who is a citizen. So this could actually get really interesting fight there. And they're going to try to paint this in, legal immigrant kind of ways. But I'll just say this, that there are plenty of people in the USA, who pay taxes, who are green card holders, who, this would affect this kind of stuff. I don't know the numbers. It doesn't say it here of like how many people are affected by this kind of stuff. But if you are, please let me know. And again, I'm not against everything in this bill. I'm just going through it. Because it's important to be honest about these discussions. A border wall, other barriers, and immigration restrictions. Okay, so this is part of the bill. So you got tax stuff and then immigration stuff. So what are they saying here? The bill designates more than $140 billion for the Trump administration's border immigration crackdown. So I guess they want to increase spending on that, basically. And they also want to increase spending on the military and related to border stuff. This is a new one. I knew that they were talking about it, but this is the first time that I had seen the more concrete numbers. So this is taxes on colleges and universities. And it'd be kind of interesting if if it ever got proposed to tax, if you're going to do universities and colleges, why not tax churches for that, for that matter. And in particular, property taxes, etc. You open up a whole can of worms when you start going after universities. That's why I mentioned churches as well. So new taxes on college and universities. So why would you do this? It says here, the legislation aggressively taxes income generated by the endowments. Okay, going after endowments, right? And if you don't know, many churches have a bunch of money and they invest it as well. For example, the Mormons, the Church of Latter-day Saints, they got a big investment fund for reals. They really do. And I've talked about it before on the channel, and they invest in all kinds of stuff. And so, I'm just saying, I'm not saying you should tax universities and you should tax churches. I'm just saying, if you open up the ball of, worms or wax, however you want to call it, to go after endowments of colleges, I think that opens the door to churches as well, and we'll see. So basically, it goes on your endowment size, and then your tax rate would increase upwards to 21%. So It's actually fairly significant. We'll see. I'm just letting you guys know what they're doing. This is an interesting one here. I kind of know where they're going, but we'll read through it. It says savings accounts for newborns. Okay. The proposal would give newborn babies a $1,000 money account for growth and advancement, or MAGA accounts, what they're calling it. Parents or beneficiaries could contribute $5,000 each year to that tax-free account until beneficiary is age 31 years old. The idea mirrors a pitch from Democratic Senator Cory Booker, New Jersey, for baby bonds. So not against that. Now, I would say, though, oftentimes when you see this kind of stuff, sometimes what they're trying to do is encourage people to invest in the market. And this is where it gets dicey. Like, so are we, are we letting people, say, invest in like really, really safe things? Or are we going to try to open it up so that you can put all your cryptos and your AIs and stuff like that? And there's going to be different people on the spectrum of the political spectrum on yes. So I'm not against the account thing. I think the account thing's fine, but how can you invest it and how much control of it? Or is it just going to be more of a general fund where it's basically pretty safe and maybe tax free? So we'll see on how they would, the details of that one's an interesting one. So I'm not against that proposal at all, though. No tax on tips is pretty self-explanatory. I just say this stuff. I think these no tax on tips, no tax on overtime stuff, I think these are red herrings in my opinion. Again, the big one would be, and I'll try to reorient the argument, is, Republicans want tax cuts for the wealthy, right? So the better way to think about it is, instead of like worrying about taxes on your tips and overtime, what if we had a more fair tax system? Well, the wealthy and the corporations paid their fair share, and we just don't worry about tips and overtime, but give you better education, a more affordable healthcare, better transportation, and these kind of things. That's something I talk about quite a bit on the channel. I know it may sound radical in the USA. People's like, no, I really want to work overtime as, a waitress or whatever, and I really care about my tax on tips. But I'd be like, yo, you'll do much better financially if your healthcare is affordable. Healthcare is expensive. I mean, you guys know this. It's legitimately really expensive. This is an interesting one. This is probably Elon Musk kind of related stuff. No tax on car loan interest. The bill would allow purchasers of American-made cars to deduct up to $10,000 in car loan interest for 4 years. So, again, that's probably to promote car sales, stuff like that. My opinion on this stuff is that I wish the U.S. would go to a, more sustainable route and not necessarily car focused. But I understand that's tough to change because it is a car focused society. But there's that. Bonus deduction for seniors. What's this? Trump proposed last year to end taxes on Social Security benefits. The bill doesn't include that provision, okay, but it would add an extra $4,000 to standard deduction for people over 65. The policy would be in place for 4 years and would taper off as recipients' income increase. And so this kind of stuff, I'm not a huge fan necessarily to tie it to age. I think you should tie it to income, because there's a lot of people out there who are over 65 that wouldn't necessarily need, more tax cuts. And so, in my opinion, that's a more fair system, but you can debate that one. I'd like, I'm sure the people out there who are older, like, Chris, you're crazy, but this is what a conversation is. I want to hear your opinion. Billions for defense, including Trump's Golden Dome. I personally don't think we need any of this stuff. And again, like, Trump will tout his no tax on tips, but that's small potatoes compared to, say, billions in defense or tax cuts for wealthy, right? So I just wanted to make sure that that's clear. What are we talking about here? There's roughly $150 billion in the bill for the Department of Defense, spending priorities, etc. And the Golden Dome kind of sounds similar to Reagan Star Wars stuff. So that's what he's talking about. Repeal Biden student loan forgiveness. Okay, legislation would save $295 billion over 10 years by repealing the administration's student loan forgiveness program and making other changes to loan repayments. So I'd be against this thing, meaning against Trump's repeal. I think it's a good thing to give loan forgiveness to people. And it depends, we can argue about the exact particulars, but if you encourage people to become teachers or become, say, doctors in rural areas, because people don't want to go, be in medical profession in rural cities or various, things for the public good, or you become a civil servant oftentimes. So basically, you tell people, hey, you're going to take a job that's going to pay less, but if you have loans, we'll give you benefits for that. So that's my opinions on that one. Tax credits for homeschooling or private school. So I'm against this stuff. I think this is essentially federal dollars going into religious stuff. So I'm not into that, but I understand people who are. So be it. We can disagree, but I'm just telling you my thoughts. Rescind money to fight climate change. I think this stuff is is a mistake. I think we should invest in this stuff. However, I do, I do think some of the stuff maybe not necessary. So, for example, it will eliminate a federal tax credit up to $7,500 for consumers that can receive for buying an electric vehicle. I'd actually for eliminating that, but there are various ways to think about how do we invest into sustainable energy for the country, right? So, and there's all kinds of corruption and stuff like that, and that involves Elon Musk. New oil and gas production. So Trump's going to be all about Joe by Joe. I have a different point of view. I'm more about sustainable alternative energy, but I do realize we can't get off of oil quite yet. So that's going to take time and investment. So it does take that. Auction electromagnetic spectrum. So this one I'm actually not sure what is this. The electromagnetic spectrum is necessary for everything from wireless technologies to military communication radars. The legislation would renew the Federal Communications Commission's authority to auction off bands of spectrum that the Congressional Budget Office says could bring in $88 billion over 10 years. And I'll be honest with you, I have no opinion on this one. I'd have to really, really dig into this. And I'd like to hear from you. I just don't have much opinion on that one. And then raise the debt ceiling. House bill would raise the debt limit by $4 trillion. That's crazy. I think with Trump's plan, the numbers don't add up. I'm just literally going through everything here. Basically, we spend more than we take in. So if you go back to the chart here, I just want to go through everything. But if you go back to the chart here, the big one is the extend the Trump tax cuts for essentially if it benefits the wealthy. So I think that's probably the big one that I would be fighting over for sure. And the other stuff, it does matter, right? But I think if you have a more fair tax system, which is literally, you can see it in the numbers here, then suddenly everything else will start to make more sense and society can function in a more fair way. That's my opinion. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think about some of these proposals? What would you, make a priority if you were to write these kind of bills? I've told you mine. Affordable healthcare. You could put in affordable housing stuff in there. Affordable transportation and affordable education. That's what I would focus on, and a more fair tax system. So do appreciate your time, everyone, and I'll catch you on the next video.